This moment, frozen in time, became so much more than just a medal ceremony. We're going to dive into the story of a silent gesture that absolutely echoed across the entire globe.
So, let's set the scene. It's Mexico City, October 16th, 1968. You're looking at the podium for the 200-meter dash. We've got Tommie Smith from the USA with the gold, his teammate John Carlos with the bronze, and in the middle, the Australian sprinter Peter Norman with the silver medal.
I'm willing to bet you've seen this picture before. It's one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. But what if I told you that every single detail you're looking at was deliberate, that there's a whole story behind the single pair of gloves, the beads, the unzipped jacket, and even the man who wasn't raising his fist at all? All right, let's start with the act itself. As the American national anthem started to play, Smith and Carlos, they lowered their heads and each of them raised a single, black-gloved fist straight into the air. Now this wasn't some spur-of-the-moment thing. Oh no, this was a planned protest. And it's so important to understand how Tommie Smith himself saw the gesture. You know, a lot of people called it a Black Power salute, but Smith, he was really clear in his autobiography. He called it a human rights salute, a statement for the struggle for basic human rights for everybody. So here's the thing, the raised fists, that was just one part of a much bigger, much more symbolic statement. Smith and Carlos knew they were on the world's biggest stage, and they used every inch of it to send a powerful message, and they did it through all these carefully chosen details. Okay, let's break this down. The black socks with no shoes? That was a direct symbol of black poverty in the United States. The black scarf that Smith wore? That represented black pride. Carlos had his jacket unzipped to show solidarity with blue-collar workers. And look closely, even the Australian, Peter Norman, wore a badge for the Olympic Project for Human Rights. He stood with them. Every single element told a piece of their story. And the depth of this message, it's just profound. John Carlos later explained that the beads around his neck, they weren't just an accessory, they were a somber memorial. They were for every single person who was lynched or murdered or lost during the Middle Passage. People, he said, for whom no one had ever said a prayer. You know, there's a really human detail from that day too. John Carlos had actually forgotten his pair of black gloves back in the Olympic Village. It was Peter Norman, the Australian silver medalist, who came up with a solution. He suggested that Carlos just wear Tommie Smith's left-handed glove. And that small suggestion, that's the reason Carlos raised his left fist while Smith raised his right. But let's be real. A gesture this powerful, on a stage this public, was never going to be without consequences. And boy, were they immediate. And they were severe.
The reaction right there in the stadium, it was not supportive. As Smith and Carlos walked away from that podium, a chorus of boos just erupted from the crowd. The message had been sent, sure, but the backlash began the very second their fists came down.
And the official response? It was even harsher. The International Olympic Committee, the IOC, they didn't pull any punches. They condemned the act, calling it a, quote, deliberate and violent breach of the Olympic spirit. But this is where the story gets really complicated. See, the president of the IOC at the time was an American named Avery Brundage. He called their salute an unacceptable domestic political statement. But get this, back in 1936, during the Berlin Olympics, Brundage had zero objections to athletes doing the Nazi salute. He argued it was just a national salute, so it was perfectly fine. The double standard is just, wow. And Brundage wasn't just talking. He put his foot down. He demanded that the U.S. Olympic Committee suspend Smith and Carlos from the team. When the USOC hesitated, Brundage threatened to ban the entire U.S. track team from the Games. Faced with that, the USOC felt like they had no choice. They expelled both athletes. Being kicked out of the Olympic Village was just the beginning. For all three of those men on the podium, the years and decades that followed were marked by isolation and hardship. This was the real price they paid. The media reception when they got back home? It was brutal. Instead of the usual Olympic celebration, Time magazine described what happened in Mexico City with 3 words: angrier, nastier, uglier. That was the story many Americans were getting.
For Smith and Carlos, the fallout was absolutely devastating. They were treated like outcasts by the American sports world. They and their families got horrible abuse, even death threats. It was hard to find work, their careers just stalled. And the pressure took a terrible personal toll too. John Carlos's ex-wife took her own life, a tragedy he believes was a direct result of the stress they were under.
And we must not forget Peter Norman. For his quiet act of solidarity, just for wearing that little badge,
He paid a heavy price back in Australia. The media criticized him, the athletic establishment turned their backs on him, and even though he qualified for the 1972 Munich Olympics multiple times over, he was left off the Australian team.
But that bond, the one forged on that podium, it was for life. When Peter Norman passed away in 2006, both Tommie Smith and John Carlos flew all the way to Australia to be pallbearers at his funeral. They carried their friend and their ally one last time. So decades pass, the world starts to change, and with it, the way people saw that moment in Mexico City started to change too. The long, slow journey from being seen as outcasts to being celebrated as pioneers, it had begun. But that journey to recognition was a long one. It wasn't until 2005 that their old university, San Jose State, unveiled a massive statue. In 2008, they got the Arthur Ashe Courage Award. In 2012, Australia's parliament officially apologized to Peter Norman long after he was gone. And finally, in 2019, Norman got a statue of his own in Melbourne. The recognition came, but it took nearly half a century. And here it is, that statue of Peter Norman. It's a permanent tribute, finally in his home country. A long overdue thank you for the quiet, courageous stand he took that day.
But let's circle back for a second to that first statue, the one at San Jose State. It's got Tommie Smith and John Carlos on the podium, but there's something really curious about it. The silver medal spot, right where Peter Norman stood, it's empty. So why would they do that?
Well, it's because that's exactly what Peter Norman wanted. He himself requested that his spot on the statue be left empty so that anyone who visits, people like you and me, could stand there in his place to feel what it was like to stand with them. There's a plaque on that empty platform, and it's an invitation, not just to look, but to participate. It reads simply, "Take a stand."